The first inning wasn't over yet. And already, it felt like everything was. The runs had scored. The walks had happened. The mound visit that nobody wanted to make had been made anyway, quietly and urgently, in the way that pitching coaches move when they are no longer managing a situation but simply trying to contain it. The stadium had shifted, not loudly, not cruelly, but in the unmistakable way that crowds shift when something is going wrong for someone they came to believe in. Roki Sasaki walked off that mound with the kind of weight that only a first-inning collapse produces. Not the clean, honest exhaustion of a pitcher who gave everything across 7 innings. Something heavier than that. The specific weight of a beginning that had already become an ending before the game had found its shape. He walked into the dugout. And Shohei Ohtani was already there. What happened in the next few minutes, in that compressed, brutally honest space between the mound and the bench, between the collapse and whatever came next, did not make the broadcast. It did not appear in the box score or the game recap or the post-game press conference that night. It appeared weeks later. In Roki Sasaki's own words. In a voice that was still carrying the feeling of that moment even after the distance of time. It's all thanks to Shohei-san. The US media stopped. Replayed it. And then asked the question that everyone was already asking. What did he say? To understand the weight of what happened in that dugout, you have to understand what Roki Sasaki came here carrying. He did not arrive in Los Angeles as a project. He did not arrive as a hopeful prospect that an organization was gambling developmental years on. He arrived as someone Japan had already decided was the future of pitching, a young man whose stuff had made scouts across 2 continents reach for their phones before his outings were even finished, whose splitter moved in ways that hitters described afterward with the specific frustration of people who had prepared and still felt helpless. The expectations that traveled with him across the Pacific were not small. They were the kind that a country builds quietly and collectively, the kind that attach themselves to a young pitcher before he is old enough to have earned them or young enough not to feel them. He felt them. And in his first real test, not in spring training, not in a low-stakes early-season game, but in a moment that the league was watching and the media was tracking and his own teammates were absorbing, those expectations collided with the brutal randomness of a first-inning meltdown that nobody had scripted and nobody could have fully prepared him for. The walks came. The runs scored. The mound visit happened. And Roki Sasaki, 23 years old and 6,000 miles from home, walked off the mound with everything that he had built in Japan sitting in the most fragile position it had ever occupied. This was the moment. Not the saves or the strikeouts or the games that would come later. This was the moment that would define, in ways that are harder to measure but easier to feel, what kind of pitcher and what kind of person he was going to be in this league. He walked into the dugout. And the first face he found was Ohtani's. There is a geography to a major league dugout during a difficult inning that most people never see clearly. The cameras find the action, the pitch, the hit, the defensive play, the manager's expression. They follow the story where the story is most visible. What they miss, consistently and completely, is the texture of what happens on the bench. The quiet conversations. The body language between players who have spent months learning how to read each other. The specific way that a veteran presence in a dugout can change the atmosphere of a moment simply by how they choose to occupy it. Ohtani occupies a dugout differently than most players. Not loudly. Not with the performed energy of a teammate who has decided that enthusiasm is his contribution. But with a quality of attention that the people around him have noticed and commented on, in the careful way that athletes comment on the things they most respect, rarely, directly, and only when asked. He watches. He notices. He tracks not just the game on the field but the people around him, the way they're carrying the inning, the specific texture of someone's struggle in real time. When Sasaki came off that mound, Ohtani had already been watching. He didn't wait for Sasaki to find a seat and let the dugout absorb him back into its routine. He didn't give the moment time to harden into silence, which is what silence does when it's left alone in a space where someone is struggling. He moved toward him. Quietly. In the unhurried way of someone who had already decided what needed to happen and was simply doing it. What followed was not long. Dugout conversations never are. The game is still moving, the inning is still happening, and the world keeps its pace regardless of what is being said on the bench. But whatever Ohtani said to Sasaki in those minutes, whatever words he chose in whatever combination of Japanese directness and baseball wisdom and simple human recognition, they were enough. More than enough. Weeks passed. Sasaki pitched again. And then again. And then, gradually and unmistakably, in the way that a pitcher finds himself when the noise quiets and the mechanics return and the trust comes back, he began to look like the person Japan had always believed he was. The splitter moved again the way the scouts had described it. The fastball found its location. The at-bats that had felt complicated started feeling manageable again. And the specific fear that lives inside every young pitcher who has walked off a mound in the first inning, the fear that the meltdown is not an isolated event but a preview, began to lose its grip. When a reporter finally asked him directly, when the question was put to him plainly, in the way that reporters ask questions when they already suspect the answer is going to be worth hearing, Sasaki didn't hesitate the way athletes sometimes hesitate when they're deciding how much to reveal. He said it without armor. It's all thanks to Shohei-san. 5 words. In a press area where multiple languages were being translated simultaneously, where the context was baseball and the occasion was a post-game availability and the expectation was the usual careful management of public narrative. 5 words that landed outside all of that. The U.S. media, which has spent years developing a particular relationship with Ohtani, admiring, analyzing, sometimes struggling to find the right framework for someone who doesn't fit the frameworks they already have, recognized immediately that this was a different kind of story. Not a transaction story. Not a performance story. Something quieter and more durable. They asked the follow-up question that everyone in the room was already thinking. What did he say? Sasaki shared enough for the shape of the moment to become clear, even if the specific words remained between the two of them. What Ohtani had understood, and what he had communicated in the dugout during that first inning collapse, was something that goes deeper than pitching mechanics and more honest than motivational language. He had understood that what Sasaki needed in that moment was not instruction. It was not a technical correction or a strategic reframe or a reminder of what his stuff was capable of when it was working. Any coach in any dugout could have offered those things. Any veteran could have pulled him aside and talked about release points and pitch sequencing and the mental reset between innings. Ohtani gave him something that only someone who had arrived in America from Japan, who had carried the weight of national expectation across an ocean, who had stood in the earliest and most fragile stages of building something in a foreign league, could authentically give him. Recognition. He told Sasaki that he knew this feeling. Not as a performance of solidarity, not as the kind of thing you say because it sounds right, but as someone who had lived a version of it, who understood what it meant to be young and Japanese and talented and 6,000 miles from everything familiar, with an entire country's investment in whether you succeeded or failed on a Tuesday night in April. He told him that this moment, this specific, awful, first-inning collapse moment, was not the definition of who he was. He had seen what Sasaki was capable of. He had watched him, the way Ohtani watches everything, with the attention of someone who takes the details seriously. And what he saw was not a pitcher who had broken down. What he saw was a pitcher who had hit the first real wall of a career that was going to have many walls, and who now had to decide what kind of person he was going to be on the other side of it. That is a different kind of message than mechanics. It is the kind that travels with a person. Sasaki went back out. Not that inning, the damage was done and the math of it was already settled. But in the innings after. In the games that followed. In the slow, honest, unglamorous process of rebuilding confidence that doesn't make highlight reels and doesn't generate graphics but is the actual substance of what a young pitcher's development looks like from the inside. He was different. Subtly, meaningfully, in the ways that matter more than the ways that are easy to see. The body language changed first. The way he stood on the mound, not rigid with the tension of someone trying not to fail, but present in the way that pitchers are present when they trust themselves enough to be in the moment rather than managing it from a distance. Then the stuff followed. Because stuff follows trust. It always does. The pitcher who is trying not to walk anyone almost always walks more people than the pitcher who has decided, on some level below analysis, that he can throw the pitch he wants to throw and it will go where he intends. Sasaki found that level again. And when he found it, the splitter came back. The fastball found its edges. The hitters who had felt comfortable in the early at-bat started feeling something different, the specific discomfort of facing a pitcher who has stopped being afraid and started being dangerous. The comeback was complete. Not because the first inning hadn't happened. It had happened. It was in the record and the memory and the hard drive of every broadcast that aired it. Nothing erased that. But because of what Roki Sasaki had decided to do with it. And because of what Shohei Ohtani had said to him before he made that decision. There is a version of Ohtani that the sport has learned to talk about. The velocities and the distances and the ERA and the slugging percentage. The records and the contracts and the arguments about legacy. The structural uniqueness of what he does on a baseball field that no framework built before him was designed to contain. All of that is real. Every number is earned. Every argument has its basis in what he has actually done. But Roki Sasaki is not talking about any of that. What Sasaki is talking about, what he could not contain in 5 words and spent several more sentences trying to explain and still could not fully capture, is the version of Ohtani that exists in the quiet of a dugout after a first-inning collapse. The version that moves towards someone instead of away from them. The version that finds the right words in the right moment for a 23-year-old who needed to hear them more than he needed anything else that baseball had to offer that night. That version doesn't show up in StatCast. It shows up in a young pitcher who came back. And in the words he chose when someone finally asked him why. It's all thanks to Shohei-san.